Welcome back to Face the Nation. With a closer look at our new CBS poll, we're joined by our Executive Director of Elections and Surveys, Anthony Salvanto. Anthony, great to have you here.
Good to be here. Good morning.
Good morning. Well, we have seen in your polling of the popular vote that this is neck and neck. As we know, it comes down to the magic 270, the electoral count, and those battleground states that have those hefty electoral votes with them are really what are being focused on by the campaigns. In your numbers, those are also dead even. Yep,
this is as tight as all this has ever been. Big picture, the national vote is everyone's voice, of course, and that all counts. But in that race to 270 for electoral votes, it's going to come down to a handful, we think 7 battleground states. Across them, it is exactly even. Hasn't really moved much over the course of this campaign. The individual states themselves are all close. I do think it's curious, this year more than others, the national vote is tracking very closely with those battleground states. It could mean we've just got a very nationalized election here.
You have, through this election, particularly since Vice President Harris moved to the top of the ticket, talked about the divide along gender lines. What are you hearing from voters?
So that gender gap, which is now in our polling the largest we've seen yet this year, is driven by a couple of things, I think, starting with people's views on larger societal factors. We ask people, what do you think about U.S. efforts to promote more gender equality? When people say those efforts they believe have gone too far, and that's a little more men who say that, they're voting overwhelmingly for Donald Trump. When people say those efforts haven't gone far enough, and many women say that, they're voting overwhelmingly for Kamala Harris.
Those numbers are pretty stark.
They really are, and it's one of the biggest splits in the election. It's a reminder that the gender gap isn't just a crosstab on a poll report. It's people expressing views about the candidates as well as the larger direction of society, frankly. And then the other part of this is when they do evaluate the candidates, you see some differences. For example, you see more men saying they believe Donald Trump would be a strong leader. Although when you ask them, they say it's not necessarily because he's a man. But at the same time, look at this measure we've been following all throughout this campaign, which is who has the mental and cognitive health to serve as president. Folks will recall we were tracking that when Joe Biden was the nominee, and his numbers dropping on that was important. Okay, now Harris has the advantage on that, and particularly among women, who are much more likely to say that only she has the mental and cognitive health. So it also affects these views of the candidates as well, these splits between men and women.
Which is kind of a remarkable question to begin with in and of itself. But you have been talking about for a very long time the huge factor the economy is, or perception of the economy is for Donald Trump supporters. The Democrats are putting reproductive health care front and center. Is that bet working for them?
Well, it motivates the Democratic base. And that's important because we may have a very turnout determining election here, right? But at the same time, I do notice that the number of people who say abortion is a major factor in their vote has been fairly steady throughout this campaign, hasn't really gone above the low 50%. And one might think that if the Democrats were getting more traction on that those numbers would go higher. And frankly, they haven't. At the same time, on the economy, Kamala Harris has been trying to separate herself from Joe Biden a little bit. And we do see in the polling more people start to say they're evaluating her on her proposals. She's cut a little bit into Donald Trump's advantage on what really is a central question. Are you better off, or would you be better off financially under which of these candidates? Trump still has the edge on that, though. She hasn't cut quite far enough in it, and so he maintains that edge for people who say that the economy is their top issue.
Rhetoric has been extremely heated throughout this campaign, but both of them are now arguing the other is the threat to democracy itself. How are voters reacting? So
a couple of things. One is you see each side does think the other one is a threat. And each side does think that democracy is under threat, albeit for different reasons, number one. Number two, though, you do see Donald Trump has often gotten a proportion of voters who feel that the whole system is broken. And I think that's really central to understanding part of his appeal. So that hasn't changed much. What you do see, and you can ask people how they want the government to work overall. And by and large, voters say they'd like the two parties to negotiate and cooperate. There are some hardcore partisans who just like their party to run everything. But there is always a component, and there is here, of people who say that they want one strong leader to cut through all of this. It happens to be a little more among younger voters, a little more among young men. And we do see more of Donald Trump supporters saying that relative to Kamala Harris supporters. This, for a larger context, does happen sometimes in democracies if you have a decline of trust in institutions, which we have also seen. It's not the majority, but that view is out there.
And that allows itself to have more manipulation of perception and what voters are thinking. It's a dangerous thing you just put your finger on. And that's why I want to, Anthony, set some expectations here on clarity. People remember days when on election night it was clear who the winner was. In very tight races, it's not going to be clear, and it may take some time. U.S. intelligence is warning there are bad actors looking to manipulate how long it may take and to manipulate your mind. What expectations should we have for the vote count?
The first word is patience. You're right that it will take a while for all our expectations. A lot of these battleground states, it's not just that they're close. It's that they've got millions of votes to count. And especially some of the larger counties may take them late into the night. It may very well go another day, another couple of days before all those get counted. We may need to see all of those votes before we can determine who's won. So patience is the watchword here. But the other thing is, we are at CBS News going to show you how this unfolds all along. I am going to show you from the data desk where the outstanding vote is, what's been reported, what the implications of all of it are in real time, so that you can watch it unfold along with us. And I think that'll be important. You don't want to just see a few votes get reported and think that's the way it's all going to go. You really have to have that patience. I would add this. Most Americans may very well cast their ballots before Election Day, right? We've got mail vote, we've got early in person. That will be over the next week, Margaret, kind of the abstract art painting of the political world. People are going to see whatever they want to see in that. We don't always know exactly how those people voted. They'll look at how many older people, younger people have voted, how many registered Democrats, registered Republicans. But since 2020, there have been shifts in the people's decisions about how to cast their ballots, and we don't know how that'll play out yet. So I urge patience there as well over the next week, and we'll have those expectations about what the early vote means once we get closer to Election Day.
And we're going to speak on this program with the secretaries of state to understand how they are administering those elections and how quickly each state, each one's different, will know the results. Anthony, thank you. We'll be right back. We turn now to the top election officials in two battleground states. Arizona Secretary of State Adrian Fontes joins us from Phoenix, and Secretary of the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania Al Schmidt joins us from Harrisburg. Welcome, and I appreciate the two of you having this conversation in a bipartisan manner. You are in nonpartisan roles as the top election officials in your states. So very quick question to both of you. Secretary Fontes first. Will you commit to certifying the election results even if the winner is of the opposite political party?
Yes, without question, that's our duty, and I believe all of my colleagues across the country would do the same.
Secretary Schmidt?
Absolutely, without any hesitation whatsoever.
Now that we've set the table on the very basics here, I want to ask you about some of the recent news. The FBI director said this past week it is incomprehensible and unacceptable that election workers have to be worried about their security. But here we are, and we know the Department of Justice just this past week did indict individuals for making threats to workers in both of your states. Secretary Fontes, one of my CBS colleagues is reporting Maricopa County is significantly increasing security and using drones, using fencing and other measures. I've read news organizations say there are going to be snipers on top of tabulation centers. First of all, is that true? That seems extraordinary. And is that based on specific threat intelligence?
Well, first and foremost, the authority and jurisdiction over the specific tabulation centers are within the counties. My office provides support for all of them, and frankly, we don't get into the specifics when it comes to our safety and security protocols, particularly the source or frequency or nature of any of the specific threats. We are in the kind of a circumstance right now where we're taking whatever precautions are necessary to ensure not just the security of the vote, but of all of our employees, our workers at the polls, at our tabulation centers, and of course, keeping first and foremost in mind the safety and security of our voters.
Can you say at a minimum whether that's increased from what you had to do in 2020?
It's absolutely completely different from 2020. In fact, I remember in 2018, our greatest security threat was a rattlesnake in the parking lot at the Pinnacle Peak precinct. So this is a radically different set of circumstances that we are dealing with, but we are prepared and we're going to have a secure election.
Secretary Schmidt, what have you had to do in the Commonwealth?
As part of the lessons learned from the experience of 2020, the Shapiro administration organized an election threat task force that I lead, made up of federal, state, and local partners in law enforcement and election administration, so that if any of the ugliness returns that we experienced in 2020, everyone will be ready. In 2020, it was, as Secretary Fontes said, so different than before, and many of us had to scramble to figure out when threats were incoming, where do we refer them to, and all the rest of that. Now we have open lines of communication. Everybody is very clear about what everyone else's responsibilities are, so we'll be prepared should, again, any of that ugliness return.
Secretary Schmidt, you heard me discuss with Senator Vance the specific intelligence that the ODNI and the FBI revealed on Friday about a fake video made by Russia to trick people into believing that ballots were being destroyed in Bucks County, Pennsylvania. How concerned are you about what U.S. intelligence has uncovered, and why do you think they're targeting your state?
Well, I'm very concerned, and it's clear that bad faith foreign actors are seeking to undermine confidence in our election results, and it's no surprise that they've targeted several of the so-called battleground states in Pennsylvania. The video that you're referring to from Bucks County, to anyone who has years of experience in election administration, was conspicuously fake. But if you don't, it's so easy for people to be sort of deceived by others trying to undermine confidence in our system of government. So it's important that our counties remain vigilant, that our Commonwealth remains vigilant, and our federal partners remain vigilant, and to call out any of these sort of efforts to deceive our voters.
Secretary Fontes, another specific warning from U.S. intelligence was some of the mind hacking, the lies being sown in the minds of potential voters. And one specific thing that U.S. intelligence says Russian influence actors are doing are posting allegations about the possibility of illegals, undocumented people voting in this country. You are a border state. We have heard a number of Republican officials, including on this program, try to argue that this is a real concern. Elon Musk is arguing that and amplifying that. What are you doing in Arizona to make sure that non-citizens are not voting in federal elections, which is already against the law?
Well, first and foremost, if and when something like that happens, it is absolutely vanishingly rare. No system is perfect, and I'll admit that right off the top. But the allegation that this is something that might turn an election or is something much bigger than it is, that's the nonsense that we are dealing with. And unfortunately, we still have candidates, elected officials, and folks with large megaphones lying. They are directly lying to the American public, and they are basically playing the role of useful idiots, now we know for sure, to foreign enemies who want to sow distrust in our democracy. They want us to be losing that civic faith that we have in one another as Americans and dividing us further. Again, the source for a lot of this information, and misinformation, I should say, is coming from outside of the United States. It gets amplified by folks in America who are helping those folks. And that's just bad. And it's bad for our democracy. It's bad for business. It's bad for the law and education and science and everything else. So what I encourage folks to do is stop being a Russian puppet, look to the folks who are actually doing the work, ask them what's actually happening, and go with the truth instead of amplifying lies from foreign adversaries.
Secretary Schmidt, what are you doing to make sure that non-citizens are not able to vote, which is already against the law?
Well, Margaret, I was a Republican election commissioner in Philadelphia County for 10 years. And I assure you, and I assure your viewers, and I assure voters that I care as much about election integrity as anyone possibly could. I investigated hundreds of allegations of voter fraud over that time, whether it involved double voting or allegations of people voting for dead people or non-citizens. And what that research showed time and time again was how incredibly rare it was that it occurred and how easy it is to catch whenever there are incidences of it. There are safeguards in the system from tooth to tail to make sure that that voter fraud, in the few instances it does occur, is identified, investigated, and responsibly prosecuted.
Secretary Schmidt, on Friday, the Lancaster County District Attorney did report incidents of voter registration fraud among a group of about 2,500 ballots. What can you tell us at this point about how many of those ballots were actually fraudulent and what happens next? Who's behind it?
The county reached out to us right away as soon as they became aware of it for guidance. As far as we can see, the county is pursuing this investigation responsibly. The county hasn't concluded that investigation, so I can't speak to the number of cases yet. We will be relying on them to make that determination and be supportive of our county partners. As part of our commitment, I visited 67 of Pennsylvania's 67 counties to sit down with them and make sure that if there are additional resources they need, additional equipment, or anything else like that, we provide that to them so that we have a free, fair, safe, and secure election in 2024, just as we had in 2020.
And it was notable in my interview with Senator Vance that he said he was confident in Pennsylvania. But when I asked about litigation, he raised the possibility of non-citizen voting and said they would be open to litigation if that were to happen.
Well, the good thing about our judicial system, which is really where our disputes should be settled, is it is always something of a put up or shut up moment when it comes to providing actual evidence of actual problems. And that when people are involved in litigation and lawsuits, they have to present that evidence. And I think that's why time and time again, in many dozens of cases in 2020, every one of those cases upheld that our elections were accurate and that were not susceptible to any sort of widespread voter fraud or anything like that.
Secretary Fontes, 95% of all ballots cast in battleground states will be recorded on paper. However, President Trump said this on Joe Rogan's podcast about a conversation he just had with Elon Musk.
He said to me that unless you have paper ballots, it can never be an honest election. That's a big statement.
It's a big statement.
We should go to paper ballots. You're done by 9 o'clock in the evening, right? Now we have these sophisticated machine. It goes up to heaven. It goes all over the place and down and around. And they say, we'll need 2 weeks to figure out who the hell won the election.
Mr. Secretary, do you want to set the record straight? And how long will it take you in Arizona to know the results?
Well, first, I'm glad that Mr. Trump agrees with the security of Arizona's elections, where we have 100% paper ballots and have had so in Arizona for several decades. Number two, it's going to take us as long as it has always taken us. While we have more voters, and in many cases in counties, a lot more voters, the time that it takes us to process our ballots is based on doing it right the first time, not doing it quickly for news cycles or for the sake of political satisfaction. We will have official results in about 10 to 13 days, but everybody knows that the networks and the newspapers will make their prognostications whenever they see fit based on their math. And that's just the way it works. We're perfectly confident that we're going to have what we need when we need it, which is when it happens, and it will be accurate.
Secretary Schmidt, how quickly will you know the results in Pennsylvania?
Pennsylvania is at something of a unique disadvantage in that our counties cannot begin processing mail-in ballot envelopes until 7 a.m. on election morning. Plenty of other states, red and blue alike, allow that process to begin days, if not weeks, in advance. But a couple things have changed since 2020. Counties have acquired additional equipment that assist with the processing of those ballots and ballot envelopes. They've a lot more experience than they had in 2020, which is the first time any of us encountered in Pennsylvania mail ballot voting in a large scale. And also the percentage of voters, while it's still widely embraced, the percentage of voters voting by mail has decreased since 2020 during that peak COVID environment. So there are several factors that will, I think, contribute to knowing results earlier, even though the law hasn't changed. But as Secretary Fontes said, it always comes down to, and has always ever come down to, how close an election is before you know who won and who lost.
Exactly. And as our Anthony Salvanto, our CBS Elections and Surveys Director, was telling us, this is a tight one. So we will be watching what's happening in your states very carefully. Thank you for level setting with all of us. We'll be back in a moment. And you can watch CBS News on election night. We will go live from our headquarters in New York City, and we'll have our teams spread out all across the country. Join us for real-time results, analysis, and exclusive polling. Our coverage starts at 4 p.m. Eastern on CBS News 24/7 streaming channel and at 7 p.m. Eastern on the CBS television network. That's it for us today. Thank you all for watching. Until next week. For Face the Nation, I'm Margaret Brennan.